Okay, so we're in verse 3, and we talked about the concept of mind training or changing our attitudes. And one thing I said in the break was that basically the first 7 verses in this text are about counteracting our selfishness. And selfishness or self-centeredness here is defined as thinking our happiness is more important than the happiness of others. That's usually what we mean when we say, "Oh, you're selfish," or "I'm sorry, I'm being selfish." We mean somebody's putting their happiness above the happiness of others, and that's a belief that people genuinely have. Sometimes it just comes on naturally because that's part of our mind and a very habitual mental state for us. But some people actually do honestly, conceptually believe that their happiness is more important than the happiness of others. That's very fascinating to observe always, because for most of us, due to our cultural conditioning, it's not exactly acceptable to be openly selfish. Like our culture, and that's sort of a good result of the Christian conditioning. For a large part of our culture, to say, "Oh yeah, my happiness is more important than the happiness of all the others," that's not culturally acceptable. That's bad. And so for that reason, we at least try to hide our selfishness or minimize it, work on it. But we don't always have the techniques for that. That's another side of having those ideals of love and compassion. For example, Christianity very, very confidently says, like, turn the other cheek, or pray for your enemies, or try to extend love and compassion to all. That these are universal religious teachings. They're actually present in all the major traditions. But we don't always know how to change our thinking or to forgive in a difficult situation. Like how to change my attitude so that I'm able to genuinely forgive you and move on, instead of just, suffering from my own anger and frustration and aversion for a long, long period of time. So these are some of the techniques. Buddhism has many more, and these techniques described here are based on other techniques, for example, on knowing how to generate love and compassion and all that. These are just elaborate ways of practicing love and compassion. But this is a good beginning, a very good beginning, and that's why the Dalai Lama teaches this so often. So the third verse, we could say, actually encompasses all of Buddhism. Every Buddhist teaching that there is contained in this verse. Vigilant, the moment a delusion appears in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay. So in this case, the word delusion is Lama Zopa Rinpoche's translation choice for what is also commonly translated into English as affliction, mental distortion. Sometimes you would hear disturbing emotions, even though that's not exactly correct, because it's not just emotions, it's other mental states as well. And in Sanskrit, that's the word klesha. Mental poison is just a good way of explaining it as well. These are just poisoning mental states that are toxic. And so Buddhism has actually an elaborate explanation of what those are. It says that the very foundational delusion or affliction is ignorance, misperception or misinterpretation of reality. And the most foundational type of ignorance is the ignorance that believes that here inside there is a fixed, self-sufficiently existent, permanent, independent, unitary self. It's like a bubble inside of me that kind of pushes the buttons and makes my body go here or my mind go there. But in itself, doesn't really change. It's really independent, it's not affected by anything. And that's why we speak about free will, which from a Buddhist point of view is a meaningless combination of words. Free of what, Of everything that else exists? Nothing exists that way. Everything is interdependent with everything. There's nothing that's completely free of anything in that respect. But subconsciously, on an emotion level, we absolutely do believe 100% that there is something inside of me that is not just my body or my mind, like some kind of soul, separate part, me-ness hidden inside. And in addition to that, we also absolutely believe that all the other phenomena exist independently. So it's not just my mind that constructs parts into this bowl and then labels it a ball. And it's not just my mind that puts a label on this bag and interprets it as good or bad, pleasant, unpleasant, nice or ugly, and so on. No, this is an ugly bag from its own side. This is a nice bowl from its own side. This is a decent person from their own side or indecent person from their own side. And we are completely blind in that we don't even notice that our opinions change 10 billion times a day. This person is nice. Oh no, they didn't quite like my post on Facebook yesterday. That's not a decent person, that's an ugly person, you know? We completely randomly interpret reality, but we do believe that each object from some side screams with the qualities we attribute to it. So that's the ignorance, the beginning of things, and that's what they study in monasteries for 20 years. How that ignorance works, and what's the wisdom that counteracts it, and how to develop that wisdom. And yogis in caves, and these days in much more comfortable conditions as well, yogis do cultivate love, compassion, altruism, all those qualities, but all those qualities of the kindness aspect of things are support for this wisdom that is the opposite of this ignorance. So that's the main delusion, the root delusion, the root poison. And then from it come many other delusions that it's actually quite valuable to learn about, to know how they operate, to learn to see them in our minds. And the two main ones that come out of ignorance, the primordial one, are basically anger and desire, or in a more fancy Buddhist way of putting things, attachment and aversion. So here when we say attachment, it's not the psychological attachment that describes a bond between a mother and a child, because that attachment from a Buddhist point of view is valuable, it's valid, it's incredibly important and beneficial. Here attachment means neurotic attachment or neurotic desire. That is, exaggerating the deliciousness of an object and believing that the object will bring happiness from its own side. Aversion is exaggerating the ugliness of an object and believing it's from its own side bringing suffering. And what these delusions or afflictions do is that they distort our perception. That's why when people practice even the popular mindfulness, not even the full-on Buddhist one, they withhold their judgments for a short while, and they see that the object from its own side is not that delicious, but neither it is that ugly. It's kind of, it has both in it. And in any case, both ugliness and deliciousness come from the mind, not from the object. So that's where the Buddha's injunction comes in, where he said, in the seen, let there be just the seen, and the heard, let there be just the heard, and so on. He was inviting us to practice this type of meditation where we withhold artificial conceptual labels long enough to see how habitually attachment, aversion, ignorance, pride, jealousy, fear, depression, everything, all of those mental states misinterpret objects all the time. Our mind is lying to us all the time. And because we don't know how it functions, we're constantly buying into that lie. So this third verse is alerting us to the problem. It says, I will monitor my mind, notice the arisal of those mental states, the toxic ones, the poisonous ones, and then I will counteract them. So I will not just notice that my mind, a certain part of my mind called attachment or anger, is lying to me about an object. I won't just notice that, oh, okay, I'm angry. Well, now I'm punching someone. Oh, now I'm being taken to prison because I've punched someone, you know? Not that. I will notice anger, and then I will do something about it. Counteract it. Use the appropriate skillful means. The technique. And this is where Buddhism teaches us 3 types of techniques for counteracting afflictions. So the basic level of practice is to run away from objects that cause disturbing mental states. So that's something that we very well know from the theory of working with addictions. Having been an addict myself, I know that in any sort of addiction, at least for the initial part of your recovery, simply stay away from the object. So you don't take your friends who are in recovery from alcoholism to bars. That's going to trigger them, at least emotionally. They're not going to be too happy to be around people who are actively drinking. In the same way, if your friend has addiction to, casinos, you don't take them gambling, right? You don't take them to places where there is gambling. So similarly, like with any sort of addiction. And here, we know that actually our mind is addicted, even if we don't call ourselves addict. It's addicted to these neurotic patterns of attachment and aversion and pride and jealousy and many other states. And so one of the simpler ways is to just run away from the objects that cause outrageous levels of those mental states. So if you know some person is making you angry enough that you might kill them, stay away from that person until you gain greater control of your mind. That's the foundational level of monastic practice. Sort of removing yourself, at least temporarily, from the objects that might trigger you too much. But it's not just for monastics. That's something that lay people practice as well. In many cases, and in many cases, the so-called Buddhist retreat is not just doing 5 hours or 10 hours of meditation per day. It's also temporarily removing yourself from different triggering situations, including your family, because families are triggering. So when people come for a 1-month course somewhere, and they're being put together to study and practice and discuss and everything, part of that is that they're outside of their habitual environment long enough that they might develop new habits. Being in a monastery with many other people is challenging in itself. You're around new people, you have to be nice. They're not always nice. You have to follow this complicated schedule and meditate a lot and talk a lot and read a lot and listen a lot and, oh my God, my knees are killing me and all that. That's not easy. It's much nicer in practical terms to be at your own house, have the leisure to wake up whenever you want and make your own cup of coffee and then follow your day and everything. But the benefit of being put in those conditions is that they are designed to help us develop new habits. And then with those new strengthened emotional and mental habits, we can come back to our coffee and our hot showers and all that and use those new patterns. So the first strategy is run away, out of self-care and compassion. That's one good way of doing things. And run away can just mean take a pause. You're in a heated argument, ask for a pause. That's actually something that is also taught by science, because when we're in a heated argument, both sides are in a so-called refractory period. That is, we're both completely distorting the information that we're receiving. That person is angry at us, we're angry at them. We're not thinking clearly. Our body and our mind need a short break, at least a short break, sometimes longer. So we need to disengage from the situation long enough to be able to reassess. Like, go for a walk for an hour or two or a day, and then see whether there's any validity in what the other person was saying, and whether everything you were saying is valid and true and loving and compassionate and all that. So that's the first strategy. And then the second strategy that is very valuable and takes a lot of study but is incredibly important is learning about the specific antidotes for specific afflictions. So for example, the opposite of the opposite of anger is love and compassion. Love and compassion counteract slightly different shades of anger or aversion. They're on the same note, basically. And there's also patience, which is a slightly different mental state. And many others. And similarly, the antidote for neurotic desire is seeing the shortcomings of the object. Well, in very simple terms, for example, the mental state that helps us overcome our neurotic attachment to chocolate cake is seeing the shortcomings of the chocolate cake, knowing A, that it will affect our body in ways that we might not want, and B, that it's never too satisfying anyway. Halfway through the cake, every time I ask myself, why did I even get that? It's not that good. I didn't spend the money and the time and everything. But we never remember that when we're in the moment of desire. That's also one of the things that addicts know very well. When you're getting the fix already, whatever the fix was, even if it was shopping or something like that, you're already regretting it in many ways. But before you got it, when you're in this anticipation, and that's the way attachment works, it seems incredibly delicious, and we really are not aware of the shortcomings. The stronger we understand the shortcomings, the greater freedom we have to choose to follow or not follow our attachment. Similarly, there are antidotes for neurotic pride, that is, thinking too high of ourselves, and jealousy, which is one of the most painful mental states. Not just romantic jealousy, but also envy, feeling bad about the success and the happiness of others. The opposite of that is rejoicing, feeling happy about the happiness of others. And there are similarly antidotes for all the different permutations of afflictions that we might have. Laziness is described in Buddhism as an affliction. It's a sort of attachment that exaggerates the deliciousness of doing nothing as opposed to doing something instructive. Laziness is the mental function that thinks, oh, just doing nothing all day is going to make me so happy. And then that's not true, because doing something meaningful and then taking proper rest would have made us happy. Not doing anything at all doesn't make us happy. It makes us feel kind of bad about ourselves, because then we feel like we're wasting this precious life. But when we're just entering the process, laziness as a mental state distorts our vision. So we need to find antidotes to that as well. Balanced ways of thinking, new emotional patterns. And the more we practice each one of them individually, love and compassion for anger, seeing the shortcomings and seeing the impermanence for desire, seeing that we're not the hottest stuff on earth for arrogance, seeing that there is joy in the happiness of others for jealousy, and so on. The more we practice with each one of them individually, the more they naturally replace the afflictions. So it's not just about knowing that love is the opposite of anger and then getting angry and then trying to generate love in the moment. You're already angry, sort of almost too late. It's never too late, but it's almost too late, because you're not going to be very effective, very efficient in generating love in that moment. At the same time, if we were practicing love and compassion in advance, and Buddhism teaches us to do that informal meditation quite a lot, and that meditation has so many benefits, then love and compassion would more naturally resurface every time we encounter any sentient being, even a being that would normally make us irritated. So we're in an airport and somebody is being very slow and incompetent about their job. Naturally, anger would arise. If we have trained in love and compassion enough, a compassion would arise. We're seeing that this being is suffering, and that's why he's not doing a very good job. We can still set the boundaries, we can still be insistent, we can still demand what's right, and at the same time not be angry, not exaggerate the negativity of the person. So that's what comes about through these practices of training in the opposite. And that's something that the Dalai Lama very, very frequently stresses, and that's something that's also part of the different secular programs that he developed. There's one for children, there's several for adults. He's been personally sponsoring them and working on them together with different universities and different researchers, so that more and more people on the planet, and not just Buddhists, have access to these techniques. More people know how to cultivate compassion and patience instead of just getting neurotically angry. But there's a deeper level beyond that, the deepest and the most profound level of counteracting afflictions, which is described in the teachings of emptiness from Buddhism, the teachings about the absence of independent existence. And that's kind of quite advanced. How it's described is that you notice that there's an affliction or delusion in your mind, such as anger, and simply by looking at its true nature, which can be the nature of emptiness or the nature of luminosity and emptiness conjoined, the anger self-liberates, as it's called, self-releases. It sort of unties like a snake untying itself. That's very advanced in many ways. And one thing that we quite often notice is that Westerners that gravitate towards these more advanced teachings on emptiness or nature of the mind they sort of think that you can be applying those methods straight away and always, and it's going to be successful. Like, oh, whenever anger arises, I'm just going to meditate on the nature of my mind, meditate on emptiness, it's going to dissolve. And it doesn't work that way, because you also have to do all the groundwork, unless you're already very advanced. And although some beings are advanced when they come into this life, most of us are not, so we will get a lot of benefit from studying the more foundational teachings on these individual antidotes and practicing with them. And it's also even suggested that it's very good to know what your predominant affliction is. If you're the person that's especially angry all the time, or desirous all the time, or jealous all the time, or prideful all the time, or fearful all the time, and so on. There's different classifications of that. And then using specific objects as the main object of your meditation on a daily basis, so that you contract that main affliction more and more, and then you can tackle the smaller ones. Yes, ignorance is the foundational one, but we would see that in our personality, one or the other can be stronger. It's sometimes described in the Southern tradition, in the Pali tradition, that we have a certain habitual neurotic response to difficulty. And so some people respond, like, I don't know, you come down and you see that your car has been stolen. Some people would respond with anger. Some people would respond with self-doubt. Some people would respond with dullness. They're just like falling asleep straight away. It's just unbearable. They go back home, they fall asleep. Turn off. Some people respond with desire. Like immediately you see your car has been stolen, first thing you do is go buy a silk pajama, because that's what you've been dreaming about. Really, that's how it happens. That's something we can notice in ourselves. And some people respond with fear. So there's a bunch of different habitual reactions that can be noticed in ourselves. And of course, we're all a mixture of everything. We have all the afflictions in us, no doubt. But something is dominating, and we can first deal with that, especially monitor that. And that's what the third verse, is teaching us to do. Notice all of our delusions, but especially the more predominant ones, by monitoring our mind. And this is where the concepts of introspective awareness and mindfulness come in. Mindfulness in Buddhism is non-forgetfulness with regards to something. So here, non-forgetfulness, mindfulness, would be with regards to the shortcomings of these afflictions. For example, I decide for myself by analyzing my mind that my main affliction is neurotic fear. I spin stories in my mind all the time. Oh, if this happens, then this is going to happen, and then the end of the world will happen. That's one of the types that we see in ourselves. Or for example, I'm angry all the time. Like, I see. Whenever something bad happens, or something that's not to my liking happens, basically, I get angry. I start yelling, I start shouting, I'm frustrated, I'm red in the face, things like that. So, I decide I will use my ability to monitor my own mind, that's introspective awareness, and I will use mindfulness, that is recollection, not forgetfulness, about the shortcomings of anger, or fear, or whatever, to work on those to become less neurotic. And as I'm mastering these three ways of removing myself from the situation, using the antidote to transform, and dissolving it all in the emptiness of the mind, I will gain greater and greater freedom from the afflictions and a greater array of the positive mental states that counteract the afflictions. So I'm literally learning to use different types of psychological medicine to counteract my different mental ailments. You get what I mean? So any questions on this one? Or the previous one? Second one? So this one, actually, all of them, but this one especially, I think, is a good foundation for journaling. And journaling is a practice has not been very widely used in Tibet historically, because very few people were literate enough. And it was also quite common, even for monks, to know how to read, but not know how to write their own texts. Very few were privileged enough to be able to write texts and have their texts preserved. But our culture is completely different. We journal all the time, write all kinds of nonsense all the time, and this is where we can find something meaningful to do. We can literally sit down with our journal and think about our dominating afflictions. What are those? And then think about what would be the appropriate antidotes for them, which we can study in greater depth with a good, basically, manual. So Approaching the Buddhist Path, this book that's I'm relying on here, it actually has a very nice chapter on different emotions, and the Dalai Lama talks about antidotes for anger, for depression, for fear, and so on. He gives basic explanations on how to cultivate those antidotes, those remedial mental states, to work with those. So in reading something like that, there are many other books that of similar nature, we can just make a simple strategy for ourselves. And then in practicing this verse in daily life, we would know what to do. It wouldn't be just abstract, I'm going to monitor all of my afflictions, but I don't know what to start with. We're going to be quite clear on, I'm going to start with this, and then also try to notice this and this and this. But at least that I'm going to work on. Immediately, there's benefit in just recognition, eventually in changing the habit. So that's verse 3, and because all of Buddhism is about overcoming all the delusions and getting free of, being free from them, you could say that all of Buddhism is included into this verse. Just liberate your mind, that's all of Buddhism basically, right? And here is the strategy. Notice the delusion and counteract it with different techniques. Then, verse 4 is much more specific than the first 3 ones. The first 2 talk about all the beings. All the beings can be precious, they are precious from a certain point of view. All the beings are superior to us from a certain point of view. It's actually, with regards to animals, something that the Dalai Lama brings up as well. Says that from a certain point of view, animals are superior to people, to humans, because animals never kill needlessly. As in, they only kill for food. They don't kill for fun. Humans kill for fun. Animals never kill billions of beings. Humans do all the time. Animals don't wage wars. Humans do. So from that point of view, animals are superior to us. They only inflict a limited amount of suffering, whereas humans can destroy all the life on the planet like this. But of course, in terms of our abilities and our ability to study and meditate and all that, we have greater freedom than animals temporarily. So there's always a way in which we can see that another being is gifted more in something. So these are quite universal, and then the third verse is all about ourselves. We are thinking about how our afflictions are endangering others, not just ourselves. That's actually a very important consideration, for example, for a person that wants to deal with alcohol addiction, because then they see, it's not just destroying my life, it's destroying the lives of all my family members, many of my friends, negatively affecting the society in general and so on. And that goes for any affliction. We know that all afflictions, if they keep growing and growing, will start destroying other beings as well, not just ourselves. Anger, if it grows, starts going beyond just shouting. Start hitting people, and then we start killing people. And then we start killing groups of people and destroying whole countries because we feel aversion to this or that ethnic group, for example. Desire, similarly, we suck the planet dry just because we want more devices, more money, more gold, more oil, more production, more anything. That's why Buddhism is so closely interested now in the so-called eco-dharma, or the ways of using Buddhist teachings in order to preserve the planet, because, the planet is almost destroyed, right? And there's only hope in changing the current situation if we start looking at the mind very closely and counteracting our incredible greed, specifically. Because greed is at the root of the environmental destruction. So, endangering myself and others. And then, seeing that, we also need to learn the technique, what to do. Then, verse 4 is about dealing with difficult people. Whenever I see beings who are wicked in nature and overwhelmed by violent negative actions and suffering, I shall hold such rare ones dear, as if I had found a precious treasure. So this is something that already is reminiscent of that idea of turning the other cheek and praying for our enemies, or for people who hate us, which is a very much a Christian value as well. So the practice here is just holding difficult people dear, seeing their preciousness. Even though it's a difficult person, we're also able to look at them and think, oh, how wonderful that you exist. And not only that, how wonderful that you exist 7 billion miles away from me, right? That's not a big achievement, although even that takes some mental effort. But also, well, how wonderful that you exist in my vicinity, around me. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with you all the time, but at least how wonderful that you're here in this workplace, for example, or on this plane, or in this monastery course, whatever. There's always difficult people everywhere. So what does it mean to do? Well, it's sort of relying on the preceding verses already, because in order to be able to practice this, we need to understand that this difficult person is also having their own feelings, emotions, moods. They want happiness, they don't want to suffer. If we don't see them as an actual human being, if we only see them as a function, just like a robot, or a piece of furniture, we won't be able to counteract the negative perception very much. But if we do see them as a genuine mind possessor, and if we do see that actually all of the trouble that we cause others, the trouble that others cause us comes from ignorance and afflictions, we're able to exercise compassion and see, oh, if you are being difficult right now, that's because you're unhappy. Sometimes so deeply. It's like one of those things where you think about all the political figures out in the world that are irritating you or all of us or most people or many people, and you're thinking, wow, it's mind-boggling what the mental state must be there to be doing things like that. How can you be doing that and facing that much backlash and hatred and aversion towards yourself, knowing probably very deeply that you're doing something incredibly wrong, and then still convincing yourself to go forth with it? As I was just saying, okay, I give up, I retire, bye, which is what most reasonable people would do. They're facing strong backlash against their unethical actions, like, okay, sorry, never mind. No, people keep pushing forth, so their mind might be incredibly overwhelmed by desire, by pride, by aversion, ignorance, jealousy, depression, completely wrong views about reality. And that's very painful in itself. All of the afflictions are in their nature painful. Anger is painful when we're experiencing it. Attachment, subtle attachment, if you actually start paying attention to it, is incredibly disturbing. Even hankering after a chocolate cake, let alone attachment to a person. It's actually deeply disturbing. You're like, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Am I going to get the cake? I'm not going to get the cake. That's painful in itself. If we closely observe our mind, we see that attachment is actually no less painful than anger. In some cases, even more so. Because anger is explosive. Attachment is just staying there and constantly making you completely unstable. But it takes time to notice that, and then projecting out to others, extrapolating that, we see, oh, you're difficult. But that's because you're suffering. Nobody's being difficult because they're happy, at least on the deepest level. And so we exercise compassion. Oh, may you be free from that mental suffering that making you so difficult. Why we're grateful to this difficult person, is that they're giving us a chance to counteract our biases and our tendency to not see them as fully human. Because our reflex is to see them and be like, oh, you're difficult, I'm going to run away. You're not a human being. I'm just going to run away from you. And what I'm saying doesn't mean that we shouldn't set healthy boundaries. It's perfectly fine. If you have an internet troll that's writing, like, pursuing you negatively, and harassing you in line, feel free to ban them. If we're having a people that's following us in real life and is actually a physical danger to us, there should be a restraining order, and we should do everything we need to protect ourselves physically. If we are in an abusive relationship and we have a chance to leave it, we should leave it, because we know that abusive relationships never end and everybody being safe and happy and la-di-da. There's always a danger of actually being physically murdered, or at least beaten, and things like that. So absolutely, none of these verses mean that we don't use common sense in providing safety and security for ourselves, for our children, for other beings, and so on. The verse talks about our mental attitude and not hating the person, but just seeing that their behavior and their mental states and what they're putting forth into the world is deeply disturbing, and feeling compassion for that. So we're seeing that this verse is inviting us to work even harder on seeing others as human, as real, as subjects of their own experiences, especially with regards to difficult people, because they provide a greater challenge, and so there's more room for our growth, for us to develop greater levels of understanding. But none of that, unless we're a very advanced yogi, means that we don't use reasonable boundaries in dealing with other people. One way to think about this verse is in terms of service providers in the medical sphere, because nurses don't have much choice in whom they are required to assist in hospitals. Teachers in schools, at least in Russian and American schools that I'm familiar with, don't have much choice about individual kids in their class. If there's a difficult kid, a teacher cannot just say, oh, no, transfer that one out. I don't want to be dealing with this one. And a nurse does not have a choice of saying, oh, I'm not going to deal with that guy. You take him, I mean, to a certain degree, maybe, but very limited. And so they're stuck with difficult people. And that includes chaplains, that includes people in hospices. You can imagine you're taking care of a human being that's very close to death and is also at the same time incredibly negative towards you, towards everyone, towards life, or very, very angry at everyone. And that's a common experience for hospice workers. And so one trick that Roshi Joan Halifax, who has been doing a lot of hospice work and a lot of research on near-death care, gives is try to see that difficult person as a baby or as a person that's actually dying right now. Because these are the two moments where all the layers fall away and we just see the raw humanity of a being, right? A baby doesn't have any layers yet. I mean, screaming and everything, it's just helpless. And a dying person also has no more layers. It might be, the dying person might be angry, it might be screaming of fear, or they might be incredibly peaceful and blissful, but in either case, they're completely helpless. They're completely reliant on us as their last support, as we're seeing them off. So in both those cases, all we can give, even if the person is angry and shouting, or if the child is scared and is screaming, is our presence, our love, our patience, our compassion. So for difficult people, trying to see them, even if it's a person that we have to be dealing with for many, many years of our life, difficult family members, for example, trying to see them in that way is a very courageous but very beneficial practice here. So that's the essence of this verse. Any questions on that? Good. On to verse 5. We're almost there. When out of envy others mistreat me with abuse, insults, or the like, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to others. This verse is very interesting because we would see slightly different interpretations of it by different lamas. So sometimes, in my experience, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche was the translator of these verses, head Lama of Kopan, when he teaches this verse, he teaches us very radically. Like giving the victory to others would mean, like, don't go to court against someone, just drop your case. Just send them a gift instead. Just completely accept the victory, completely accept the defeat and give the victory even in legal terms. If it means you're getting poor, that's a very courageous level of bodhisattva practice. Sort of a little bit above our pay grade as beginners. The Dalai Lama gives a much more timid explanation of that, or much more moderate, where he says, it doesn't mean you don't go to court when you need to correct injustice. It doesn't mean you don't fight for the rights of others or your own rights that have been abused. It does mean, though, that you're becoming more open, patient, and less vindictive. which means, in very practical terms, you don't always have to have the last word in an argument. And you don't always have to jab back when somebody is jabbing you. Verbally, most of the time. That's where 99% conflicts that we have are. Yes, this verse also pertains to conflicts in international terms. It's like, how do we solve problems in the Middle East or anywhere else where there is conflict? This is where contemplating this verse and having a very large common conversation would be of benefit. And this is where we can turn to the incredibly inspiring example of one of the Dalai Lama's closest friends, Bishop Tutu, who was the head of the Reconciliation Committee in South Africa. So we all know that South Africa had very deep problems for a long time, and then there was a need to move towards a completely different structure of society without having so much hatred and so much vengeance basically coming from both sides, that there would just be a civil war and a constant bloodshed. So Bishop Tutu established a very, very enlightened, in a way, structure where all the sides had a chance to speak their grievances, as in, like, say, this is the suffering that we have taken from you. And at the same time, we're able to say, and this is the suffering that we inflicted upon. So because of this ingenious way in which Bishop Tutu guided this reconciliation process, South Africa is sort of functional right now, and there's no civil war and bloodshed. And of course, there's problems that run very deep, just like everywhere, but in general, it was a great effort that allowed the country to avoid much deeper problems and much greater violence. So in this way, sort of coming to a process of dealing with a conflict and conflict mediation and all those sorts of things, and being able to say, I see the validity of your point. It is valid in many ways. That's also giving victory. So that's, for example, something that I try to practice quite a lot in dealing with my best friends. Because when you're best friends with someone, you know each other so well, it's very easy to jab someone if you want to, if you feel offended. It's also very easy to constantly be like, oh, hey, here you go again, as in, I know you so well that I can just limit you to this box of an idea that I have. And it's quite hard to be constantly admitting, yes, you are right, I am wrong in this situation. Or, yes, your point. And then sometimes it's also difficult to be humble enough to say, I see the validity of your point, please see the validity of mine. It's actually taking humility to offer that vulnerability. So all that falls under this verse. But at least, that's what the Dalai Lama is saying in his commentary here, at least offer the victory to others, but not by not feeling that you always have to have the last word, that you always have to be right, that you always have to use the meanest words that you can have just to win an argument. You don't. And often winning would not lead to any good either. The other side is just going to be more pissed at you. And you might hurt them in a very profound way for the rest of their lives, let alone ruin the relationship. So sometimes just shut up and accept the defeat as in, like, okay. Or just step away. That's also sort of offering the victory. And then find ways of bringing more understanding and more compassion, more love by informed dialogue. So that's at least the level of practicing this verse that is available to all of us. There are more advanced levels of it, of course, but it takes time to grow and develop and progress towards those. And even in this level, it's very complicated, very brave, courageous, but definitely doable, I think. So that's verse 5. Anything on that? Doubts, fears, reservations? What do you think the typical objection to this verse is? Like, no, we shouldn't be doing that because then...
I get so fed up with people that continuously say, well, that's your karma, you're suffering because it's your karma. Yeah. And then sort of absolving themselves of any responsibility whatsoever.
Yeah.
I get so fed up with it.
I think that's like saying that's your karma, and another thing very typical is, oh, that's just your impression.
Oh, exactly.
That's just your perception.
Exactly.
That's just, and then I think that's in the Dharma communities that I've been studying within the States, one rule that's set forth for all the members and the participants is recognize impact versus intent. It's like you can never say, oh, I didn't mean any bad, it's just you took it that way, you know, sort of sorry, not really. Because that just hurts people so deep. So it's perfectly fine to say, I didn't mean to harm, but I did harm through what I said. And so I'm very sorry and I want to be better next time and that opens a dialogue. I'm admitting that it isn't just your impression. My words, it isn't you took my words that way. Which is also something that the celebrities can no longer get away with. Like there's more and more stories of celebrities in the United States media where they say something racist, for example, and they can no longer issue an apology that says, oh, I'm sorry, some people felt offended. That's not a real apology. You should be saying, I'm sorry, I said stupid things that were very offensive. That's the real apology. So similarly here.
So again,
Yeah.
sorry, but I need to write that down, what you said. But this basic foundation is that you, what did you say exactly, this rule?
Intent versus impact.
Intent versus impact.
Impact, yeah. There's some very good work done in California by Dharma Center called East Bay Meditation Center. And it's kind of recognized as the most diverse meditation center in the United States. And they have a certain set of guidelines that I'll email you personally, basically, that are very good around that. Yeah, I'll just email that. Because a growing number of even professional organizations have been adopting that. And these are, I think, called rules for cross-cultural interaction, something like that.
Impact versus
Intent. So my intent might be, oh, I'm just saying things, sharing, you know, but I say racist things and sexist things and all kinds of things that offend so many people in the room. And I cannot just be saying, oh, I didn't mean any harm, because
or put it back on the other person. This is your practice, like, you know, this is your karma to experience somehow.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes, it's like to apologize, that say it's your fault to be offended.
Exactly, I'm this enlightened bodhisattva that's just bringing benefit to this world, and you're so unenlightened that you took offense with my words.
Yeah.
You know?
No, this isn't really a good discussion.
But in this point, I will say for me, this is the
Most difficult.
no. I will say is the easiest.
Oh.
I would say like
The easiest.
But society
I think so.
goes on.
Like to like you said, to walk away, or to like here it says to give the victory to other one. Like okay, I mean it's an option to say I don't want to get further on the discussion. Okay, and you might be right, or you're right, and
Yeah.
but it also takes how the other person is going to react, you know, because the other person might continue on the discussion. I don't know. It can happen. You know? I mean, this verse is not only is not only how you react, but it interacts on other persons.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. So one point here is that there's also the input of the other person in the situation, and even if you do sort of offer a victory to them, they might continue being angry and shouting and yelling and pursuing the discussion and so on. And that's all very important. And I think sometimes in the Dharma, we hear things like, "Oh, you're not responsible for anything anybody else is feeling or saying or doing." And I think that's a dangerous statement, because I think we're not ultimately responsible for what others people are feeling and doing and saying. But we shouldn't be too light on ourselves by saying, oh, it doesn't matter then how people react. So one example people give is like, oh, you're leaving to do Buddhist retreat or something for several months, and you're completely abandoning your family obligations, something like that, and your family is pissed with you. In some cases, people brought that up, and people who give Dharma talks said, oh, it's, you can't control your parents' reaction, you can't control your grandparents' reaction. That's true. It's like, you cannot be like tiptoeing around everyone all the time. but that doesn't mean that we're absolved of the responsibility to try to find the best way of being skillful with others, being loving with others, being truly compassionate with others. So that's one point. There's always this we're always looking for the finer and finer balance in these things between thinking nothing is our responsibility or feeling completely responsible for others. So there's that. And another point that you brought up that I think is important is that sometimes there's just offering the victory genuinely, and sometimes we just like to avoid conflict. And that's an interesting balance as well. And that's something Venerable Rubina, who's going to be teaching the Copenhagen course, often says. She says there are people who like conflict, and there are people who like avoiding conflict. And I myself, I'm a conflict avoider. I don't like, well, also not always, because I also like to start social revolutions and rage against the broken system all the time. But sort of like in interpersonal communication, somebody is like so riled up, they're shouting, I'm like, whatever, I don't care. Sure, you're right. But that's, for in many cases, for me, from my side, that's just passive aggression. I'm not really being compassionate or loving. I'm just being like, yeah, whatever. I just want to avoid the discomfort for myself. So offering the victory truly means doing it out of love and compassion and understanding genuinely, and certain humility, while also keeping deep love, compassion for ourselves. So these are skills that we refine over time. It's not going to be day one, I'm passive aggressive, and so I'm offering the victory, or just fighting for victory for myself. And then day two, I'm free of all those and just lovingly offering the victory to others. It's going to be years and years of that very fine tuning of these skills. And that's where actually insight into emptiness, insight into wisdom plays such a big role, because eventually it's only this genuine wisdom attained from meditation that actually removes our self-clinging deeply enough that we can actually offer the victory, because we're seeing that we're not a fixed person. It's just a combination of factors labeled me and other people as well, and it's most skillful in this situation to accept, acknowledge, agree, and so on. But in another situation, we are actually offering the victory to others by doing the hard thing, for example, fighting for the rights of others. So for me personally, it would be much easier to sit back and enjoy my privilege and like my comfortable, calm existence. It's much harder to continue working for others and facing sleepless nights and being a nurse, for example. There are many other jobs that are simpler and bring more money and whatever. But then you think, well, what would be most beneficial for others? And then from that point of view, you are offering the victory to others, to all the beings who are going to benefit. And for you, it's not very comfortable. Even though it might be of benefit to you in terms of your development, your growth, your greater compassion, your awakening eventually. So, find balance. That's the most important Buddhist point. Finding the balance, and the way it's done is you identify the two extremes and you sleep between them. In any Buddhist discussion, that's always the answer. Like, is it good to eat meat? Find one extreme, find another extreme, find the middle ground between that. Yeah, because one extreme, that's just a simple example, but that's something that people often ask about, including the Dalai Lama. In every public teachings that he gives, he's always asked that. Oh, is it fine to eat meat if you're a Buddhist? What do Buddhists think about vegetarianism and veganism and all that? So two extremes. One extreme is, oh no, it's perfectly fine to eat meat, don't care, whatever. Another extreme is like, no, even if you're dying, never touch meat. You're dying and the only food is meat, don't eat it, die. Obviously, a stupid extreme. Find the middle ground between them. And there are many levels to that middle ground, but at least that. So that's how we practice with all of these verses, but especially this one, I think. Then verse 6 is one of the most difficult ones, if not the most difficult, because it's about being betrayed, and a feeling of betrayal is a very, very complicated thing. So it says, when someone whom I have benefited and whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my holy guru. And practice here is working with disappointment and betrayal through forgiveness. That's how the Dalai Lama describes it, even though word forgiveness is actually not that often used in Buddhist context. We often hear it in Christianity, like all the time. Forgiveness is a big thing. Buddhism doesn't have a lot of classical teachings on forgiveness. There are definitely some, including some very interesting mind training texts that I've seen. It's called Mind Training, Dissolving the Grudges or something like that. There's a specific text with a specific visualization that's used to do that. But generally, we don't hear about forgiveness that often in Buddhism. We do hear about love and compassion all the time, that's for sure, and patience. So, but the Dalai Lama brings forgiveness up. He brings up forgiveness here as the antidote. And basically, what forgiveness means is letting go of our anger, like no longer holding the anger about something that is negative that happened to us. And it doesn't mean it doesn't matter whether it's our karma or not. From Buddhist point of view, everything is our karma. Like the color of this table, each colored pixel that we see on this table, each pixel of color on this bag, on this piece of paper, on this bowl, each sound that we hear, including the birds and the cars and everything, each single aspect of that is brought about by specific karmic causes. So from a Buddhist point of view, since everything is karma, in some cases, it's meaningless to say it's karma. Rather, it's meaningful to talk about how to deal with a situation. And from a Buddhist point of view, it's always meaningful to try to be compassionate, be loving, be ethical, try to do better next time, instead of blaming it all the karma. Actually, how karma works is through being loving, compassionate, and trying to do better. But here, once again, there's a fine balance. We're saying that someone is betraying us. Someone has betrayed us, or betrayed our expectations at least. And that can be personal or global. I think one thing people face a lot is being disappointed with their teachers, especially their spiritual teachers. It's like it's not such a big deal if your college professor, does something stupid, because we don't have actually the idea, or historically we didn't have that at least, that college professors necessarily should be enlightened human beings. They're fallible, and even when I was a student, and certainly I know from what Bell Hooks writes in the United States, when she was a student decades ago, it's quite expected of your professor to give a talk, lead a seminar, and then, for example, go and get drunk with our friends or something. That's the academia for you. You teach during the day, you go to your club, and you get drunk during the night, something like that. It's like, what else do you expect? But then when people see that spiritual teachers do something very human and not in the best possible way, that causes a huge sense of betrayal. And then, of course, same with, for example, politicians that you might have supported. There are some very, very bright young people who are entering the political sphere in almost all the countries in this world, and it is inevitable that some of them will eventually have opinions that don't correspond to ours. They're going to do some things that we do not agree with. Inevitably so. We should expect that from the onset, but we don't. And the same thing, of course, with friends, especially closest friends and romantic partners. So this is also about balance, because one thing, very important consideration, if we are betrayed in a situation, from a Buddhist point of view, is that our karma. It is our karma to experience negative feelings about what's happening. That's what karma is. It is our karma to be in this specific situation. Does that mean it's our fault? No. Buddhism never uses that word. At least Buddhism has translated eventually into English. It never says, oh, you've been betrayed and it's your fault karmically. That's an incorrect, improper, unhelpful way of thinking about things. Oh, it's my fault. And it can be deeply damaging if we think of things in that way. Oh, it's my fault that I've been betrayed, that I've been cheated upon, that I've been abandoned, that I've been cheated in monetary affairs and so on. Actually, that's one very interesting thing, is I've been doing some reading about the psychological effect that cheating has on couples. It's like one partner cheats upon another. So it says, according to the research that I've seen, that the partner that's being cheated upon and learns that they've been cheated upon eventually, they have symptoms that correspond to the post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. The same symptoms. The only difference is that a veteran has been subject to actual physical violence. There are bombs around and shooting and all that. And the person that's being cheated upon has not. But they display the same symptoms of anxiety, incredible self-doubt, trouble sleeping, depression, crippling levels of fear, crippling levels of paranoia, and so on. And like behavior that comes from it is quite obvious. You're checking your partner's phone to see if they're cheating again, we all can imagine what those things are. So actually being betrayed is very deeply traumatizing, any type of betrayal. So we shouldn't take it lightly, but at the same time, what the verse is talking about is, how do I get out of that pain? Not even for the other person's benefit yet. Yeah, sure, eventually I want to help them become awakened as well, because they're suffering right now. They've betrayed me. But at least for my sake, how do I let go of this anger, this pain, this trauma? And that's what the verse is talking about. But regarding that person as my holy guru, should not be should not be romanticized and like, oh yes, or we shouldn't take it to the extreme straight away. Think, yes, we should write a letter to this person that just dumped us or betrayed us or stole our money or whatever, and say, yes, thank you so much. You've taught me so much about my own mind, and it was all my karma, and I'm very grateful. You helped me purify my karma and develop patience. Like, no. First of all, keep the distance, please. Be reasonable. You're not yet ready to face that person and reconcile. For most of us, that's the case. Most of us would take years before we're able to have any discussion. Yes, there are people who are more gifted than that. You see those amazing documentaries about families of victims of violence forgiving the perpetrator. That's good on them. We shouldn't think that we necessarily have to be like that if we're not. For us, it might take years before forgiveness kicks in. And the verse teaches us how to help ourselves with that. So one thing is to see, the Dalai Lama says, how tiresome it is to harbor anger for a long time. Anger is incredibly painful in us. It keeps re-traumatizing us. So we see the drawbacks of anger, the shortcomings of anger. And just through that, we're like, oh my God, I want to stop thinking about it. I want to stop hating that person. Not for their sake yet, but for my own sake. Hatred is killing me from the inside. That person might not care at all. Most of the times they don't. Then another thing is, well, yes, that person has taught me something about fortitude and about the nature of reality. Because yes, people will be betraying us, not like out of free will. Nobody has free will in that respect, but because their afflictions are too strong for them not to betray us. And actually, I have the same afflictions. So at least that person is showing me a warning. They're showing me what I would do if I allow my afflictions to continue growing and manifesting. So that's all the more reason for me to work on my mind right now, so that I don't betray other people in that way. And the third point here that the Dalai Lama also brings up is actually I did betray a lot of people myself. Maybe not in big ways. Not everybody cheats on their partner. But there are certainly people that haven't had an answer email from me in like years. I've been expecting that. That's sort of a betrayal. I've betrayed their expectations. I've betrayed the rules of constructive business interaction. Because it's sort of ideally expected that if you get an email, you should answer it, I don't answer every email again. I don't have the energy or the time, but also I know I don't have enough love and compassion maybe yet in some cases. Or I see that as a healthy boundary not to answer every insane email I get, but still, for the other person, that might feel very painful. So I've inflicted pain on others in the same way, and yes, there is definitely a need for me to recognize my intent, impact, that dichotomy. I didn't have the intent necessarily to harm, but I did. And in some cases, I did have the intent to harm, and the impact was harmful. And that makes me more humble in the face of betrayal from others. Not in the way of, oh, I was harming others, so now it's my karma to get betrayed. It doesn't work that way. Karma doesn't usually actually, from a Buddhist point of view, ripen in the same life. So if you betrayed someone when you were 17, and then you get betrayed when you're 25, very high chances from a Buddhist point of view. It wasn't the same karmic chain. But it sort of still comes down to the same habits that are karmic. I do have a habit of being irresponsible, for example, and then at the same time I'm very pissed when other people are irresponsible with me. So analyzing all that teaches me to be more humble, to see, oh, I've been irresponsible and but shameless in many cases in my life. So I shouldn't be too hateful of this other person. They're just like me. And the best thing I can do for now, at least, is to try to forgive them, try to forget them, wish them well, have some compassion for them. That's it. Keep safe and healthy distance if that's needed, for as long as needed. Even if it's your whole life, we will keep coming back to the same people. If we try to keep compassion and love for this person for the rest of our natural lives, definitely our next encounter will be better, because we completely change the imprint, the habit, the habitual perception. And plus, it never hurts to do what Christians suggest, which is to pray for the people who have been hateful towards you. That's also Buddhist practice. Like, Buddhists do lots of prayers and mantras and chanting and loving kindness and sending good energy and so on. When you're ready, do some of that for the person that harmed you. That's also teaching you incredible levels of humility, compassion, love, understanding, seeing the fallibility in all of us, but also seeing the good in all of us. So from that point of view, that person is our teacher. But it's not to romanticize it and say, oh, straight away we should be imagining them above our crown and like sending flowers to them and straight away. No, it takes time to go up to that. And I think, one thing that is very important about these verses is that just because we're human, we tend to try to use them to beat each other up. It's like, aren't you Buddhist? Shouldn't you be practicing mind training? That person betrayed you. You should be thinking about how they're your holy guru. These are verses for our own reflection, not to be like telling others what to do with those and telling others that they're not practicing good enough with these. Because that never turns out well anyway. That just brings more conflict and more dissatisfaction and more feeling like, mind your own business, my practice is my practice. So, I would say this is the most difficult situation of all discussed here that we might encounter, and for that reason the most difficult practice. Often it has to do with family members, romantic partners, business partners, but we can also see how it projects even upon celebrities that we might have been crazy about, and then they turned out to be not so good as human beings. Well, we see their humanity. They're fallible as humans, just like we are, and love and compassion in an informed and intelligent way. Doesn't mean we don't have to talk about problematic things. We need to divorce the person and the behavior, avoid the cognitive fusion, and we can speak out against the behavior without hating the person. That's the main principle embedded within these verses 4, 5, and 6. Not confusing the person with the behavior, being quite straightforward about the behavior, trying to have some love and compassion, and eventually great love and compassion towards the person. Right. Oh, we have 1 minute, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the last two. Verse 7, ensured both directly and indirectly to offer every happiness and benefit to all my mothers, I shall secretly take upon myself all their harmful actions and suffering. This is actually a description of very special Buddhist meditation called taking and giving. It's a special practice that was originally secret in the Tibetan tradition. Eventually it was taught openly, but even then it takes some preparation before we're able to do that. So the practice is that we imagine that we're taking upon ourselves all the suffering of all other beings, including their negative karma and their afflictions, and we're giving to them all the types of happiness, but not just abstract happiness, our own happiness, our own positive karma, our own wisdom and understanding and love and compassion, transferring it all to them. From a practical point of view, it's incredibly unlikely that we'll be able to take the negative karma and the suffering of others. Only incredibly advanced beings can do that, and only in specific situations when there's a very strong karmic bond. In some cases, when there's a very strong karmic bond, even sort of common beings like us can do it. For example, a mother can sometimes do that for her child. It has to be that level of connection, very strong connection. For most of us, 99.99999% of the time, it's just mental training. It's not actually taking suffering, giving happiness. But it's an incredibly powerful form of mental training. And within that, it's actually very advisable to first practice loving kindness and compassion, the two sides of this practice, individually. So just do some loving kindness meditations. There's a lot of very good stuff out there, good books, guided meditation, and so on. Exercise in that. Separately, do compassion practices, meditate on that. Very, very beneficial. And then eventually learn how to combine them in one practice, which is then taking and giving. And it's also quite common to combine those with our breath. So in that case, we would be taking all the suffering with the in-breath, giving out all the happiness with the out-breath. And great masters are sometimes doing that 24/7, like all the time. That's their natural practice that they do all the time. And thus develop incredible levels of love, compassion, altruism, and eventually a very, very unique mental state that's described in Buddhism, and that's taught in these verses as well, which is called bodhicitta, the wish to become a fully awakened being for the benefit of all sentient beings. So verse 7 is specifically on how to develop bodhicitta. It's mentioned here in the commentary, through this unique practice of taking and giving. But there are other preliminary steps that can be learned to enhance this practice. For example, in the traditional sequence, it's said that we should also learn how to contemplate the drawbacks of self-centeredness and how to think about the benefits of altruism as meditations. Like those are meditations in themselves. And then eventually they would also support this practice of taking and giving, which, as it says here in the text, is to be done secretly. Secretly has two connotations. One is that this practice is secret until we have trained in other practices. So it's very advanced. We shouldn't be jumping into it necessarily. So a good beginning is to start with loving kindness for ourselves, compassion for ourselves, then build on that. And another consideration here is that this practice is secret in that we don't advertise it. Especially one thing not to do is to go to a person and say, oh, I hear you've been having some problems. Well, don't worry, I've been doing this taking and giving meditation for you. See how kind I am? I'm meditating so that you will get better. That's ridiculous, because for most people, they'd be like, okay, thanks. If they don't believe in Buddhism, they'd just be annoyed or, what? Better give me some money, something like that. But even for Buddhists, it just seems very pretentious to be announcing to others that we've been meditating on taking and giving for them. It's something to do secretly without any pretense, and changing our appearance in any way. So it's said in the teachings, change yourselves on the inside, stay normal on the outside. Like, don't get outrageous. And then the verse 8 here is this: undefiled by the stains of the superstitions of 8 worldly concerns, may I, by perceiving all phenomena as illusory, be released from the bondage of attachment. So the 8 worldly concerns, as it says here in the commentary, is being delighted when we have possessions, pleasant experiences, praise, and good reputation. Basically all the things that we're crazy about in life. Popcorn, ice cream, pleasant words, pleasant music, being famous. That's pretty much, and having money to afford all of that. If you have money, you can buy the 3 others, except for health. And then feeling dejected or sad when we don't have possessions, when the experiences aren't pleasant, when we face criticism and we have a bad reputation. This is basically describing a normal person and their goals in life. I want to have good reputation, hear pleasant words, have many pleasant experiences, and have lots of money. And I don't want to face the opposites of that. The trick here is that nobody's saying it's bad to have money, it's bad to have nice ice cream, it's bad to hear pleasant words, it's bad to have good reputation. All of these things are incredibly helpful if you want to be of help to others. If you don't have any money, you have a terrible reputation, you're surrounded by terrible sensory experiences, and also people are criticizing you all the time, you're probably not going to be very efficient in starting charitable projects and giving Dharma talks or anything. These are helpful tools. The thing here is, don't overestimate those, because they are impermanent and they're not in their nature satisfying. So this part, the part about 8 worldly concerns, teaches us how to develop what Tibetan Buddhism calls renunciation. And renunciation simply means knowing that we don't want to suffer, and avoiding the causes of suffering, knowing that we want to be happy and following the true causes of happiness, not the temporary ones, not the transitory ones. So that's the first part, renunciation. And the second part, by perceiving all phenomena as illusory, be released from the bondage of attachment, that's about actually that wisdom that we discussed, the one that counteracts our belief in a stable, independent self and independently existent phenomena. So there are slightly different venues for developing that, different types of emptiness meditation, different styles of teaching that, and they're all very valuable and helpful. Many people study several of those, some just one. In monasteries, they usually study 2 or 4 main styles over a number of many years. But then it's also not uncommon for some yogis to just study one style in a brief period of time, but then really practice with it. So that there are different ways to go about developing this wisdom. And the important thing is that once we develop that wisdom truly, it will liberate us from the 8 worldly concerns, and it will give us so much more freedom to practice the meaning of the first 7 verses. So the 8 verses kind of creating the foundation and the freedom around the first 7 verses. It's saying, you will only be able to truly be compassionate and loving when your mind is free because of your practice of wisdom. So in the Buddhist tradition, especially in the Tibetan tradition, it's always said that the bird has to have 2 wings. It has to have the wing of compassion, it's usually the right hand, and the wing of wisdom, understanding, exceptional level of common sense. So once those 2 are conjoined, only then are we actually starting to progress through the stages of the path and eventually become a Buddha. But even on our level, we can always develop slightly greater levels of wisdom, slightly greater levels of compassion, and that's what these verses are pretty much about. So come back to them if you want. Check out the different commentaries online and in the book that I mentioned here, Approaching the Buddhist Path, and see if any of it makes sense and can be applied in daily life. That's all we can hope for, right? So with that, let's just think for a moment about everything that we've heard on our own, just digesting meditation, as it's called. And think if there was 1 point, 2 points that we found especially helpful or interesting, or practically applicable. And if so, we can aspire to learn more about that point, and also mentally we just generate joy about everything that we've done. It's been a meaningful day. And mentally dedicating all of this effort so that we may become happier, healthier people for the benefit of all beings, and maybe one day become a Buddha as well. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. It's been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.